I'd been out of steady work for about 7 months when I found the listing. It was buried in one of those federal job boards that look like they haven't been redesigned since 1997, the kind where half the postings are for seasonal maintenance positions in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. Fire Lookout Observer, Bitterroot National Forest, Ravalli County, Montana. GS3 pay scale. Housing provided. June through October. The description was sparse. Monitor for wildfire ignition events. Maintain communication with district dispatch. Record weather observations. Perform routine facility maintenance. There was a note at the bottom that said, "Tolerance for extended isolation required." I remember reading that last line and almost laughing, because isolation was the entire point. I was 31 years old. I'd just come out the back end of a relationship that had dissolved so slowly, I hadn't even noticed it dying until it was already decomposed. Lauren had moved to Boise. I'd stayed behind in our apartment in Missoula, paying rent I couldn't really afford on unemployment, and the dwindling savings from my last GIS contract job. My friends, the ones I still talk to, had started doing that thing people do when they're worried about you, but don't want to say it directly. Checking in too often, suggesting hikes, asking if I'd thought about talking to someone. I didn't want to talk to someone. I wanted to not talk to anyone. I wanted to sit somewhere high and quiet and watch the world from a distance until I remembered how to be a person inside it again. So I applied. And because nobody wants these jobs anymore, not really, not the way they used to, I got a call back within 2 weeks. A woman named Darlene from the Sula Ranger District office asked me a few questions. Did I have any experience with radio communication? Had I ever lived alone for extended periods? Was I comfortable with heights? Could I identify basic tree species native to the northern Rockies? I said yes to everything, which was mostly true. She told me the position was at a lookout called Sheephead Point, elevation 7,400 feet, accessible by a 9-mile trail from the nearest forest road. She said the last observer had finished the previous season without incident and had chosen not to return. When I asked why, Darlene paused for a moment and said, "Some people just prefer one season." I didn't think much of it at the time. I drove down to the ranger station in Sula on a Tuesday in early June. The town, if you can even call it that, is barely a wide spot on Highway 93 between Missoula and the Idaho border. The ranger station was a low brown building with a flagpole and a parking lot that could hold maybe 10 vehicles. Inside, it smelled like old paper and wood stain. Darlene turned out to be a heavy-set woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the kind of calm, unhurried voice that comes from decades of working in a place where urgency is seasonal. She gave me a stack of paperwork. She gave me a radio, a Bendix King handheld that felt like it weighed 3 pounds, and showed me how to operate it. Channel 1 was dispatch. Channel 3 was the general lookout frequency. Channel 6 was for emergency traffic only. She told me I'd check in with dispatch every morning at 0800 and every evening at 2000. She told me I'd take weather readings 4 times a day using an instrument shelter mounted on the catwalk. She showed me how to use an Osborne firefinder, which is basically a rotating sighting device bolted to a pedestal that lets you triangulate the position of a smoke column. She told me my nearest neighbor would be a lookout named Gary at a place called Ward Peak, roughly 14 miles to the north-northwest. "Gary's been doing this since before you were born," she said. "He's good company on the radio, if you want it. If you don't, he won't bother you." She drove me to the trailhead that afternoon. The road in was rough. 10 miles of washboard gravel that rattled my fillings. At the trailhead, there was a small wooden sign that said, "Sheephead Point Trail, Hazhon 08, and nothing else. Darlene helped me organize my pack, which was enormous. Food for 2 weeks. The radio, extra batteries, a first aid kit, binoculars, fire-finding charts, a sleeping bag, clothes. There would be additional supplies cached at the lookout, she said. and a mule team would bring up resupply every 2 weeks through the season. She shook my hand and told me to radio in when I reached the top. Then she drove away and left me standing at the edge of the Bitterroot wilderness with a 60-pound pack and the first real silence I'd heard in months. The hike in took me just over 5 hours. The trail climbed steadily through lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, switchbacking up a drainage before cresting a ridge and following it south along a rocky spine. The last mile was steep and exposed, the trail cutting across a talus slope with views that opened up in every direction like the world was unfolding. I could see the main spine of the Bitterroots to the west, still heavy with snow. To the east, the Sapphire Range was lower and drier, its foothills already going gold with early summer grass. The sky was that particular shade of Montana blue that doesn't seem quite real, too saturated, too deep, like someone adjusted the contrast on the atmosphere. The lookout was at the top. It was a standard 14 by 14 cab on a 20-foot timber tower, the classic L4 design that the Forest Service built hundreds of in the 1930s and 40s. A wooden staircase with a railing led up to a catwalk that wrapped around all 4 sides. The cab itself was mostly windows, with shutters that could be propped open for ventilation. Inside, there was a cot, a propane stove, a small table, 2 chairs, a shelf of field guides and topo maps, the Osborne firefinder on its pedestal in the center, and a pair of mounted binoculars near the south-facing window. Everything was clean, but worn. The wood floors had the soft gray patina of decades of use. Someone had left a coffee mug on the shelf with a small chip in the rim. The propane tank was full. The instrument shelter on the catwalk held a thermometer, a hygrometer, and a rain gauge, all functional. I set my pack down and stood in the middle of the cab and turned in a slow circle. Through the windows, I could see maybe 60 miles in every direction. Forested ridges, deep blue canyons, the white teeth of the Bitterroot Divide, the pale haze of distance. I was the highest point for miles. I was completely alone. And for the first time in what felt like a very long time, the pressure in my chest eased, and I felt something close to okay. I radioed Darlene at dispatch and told her I'd made it. She confirmed receipt and told me to get settled. I unpacked. I made a meal out of canned chili and crackers. I watched the sunset turn the mountains, the color of a bruise, purple and gold and fading. I crawled into the sleeping bag on the cot and listened to the wind push against the cab and the soft ticking of the wooden frame adjusting to the cooling air. I fell asleep faster than I had in months. The first week was something close to perfect. I fell into the routine like water, finding a channel. Wake at 6, boil water for coffee on the propane stove. Step out onto the catwalk and take the first weather reading. Temperature, humidity, wind speed, estimated by observation, wind direction, sky condition. Log everything in the green hardcover book Darlene had given me. At 8, radio dispatch with the morning report. Then, the day was mine. I'd spend hours with the binoculars, scanning the timber for smoke. I'd read the field guides. I learned to identify Clark's nutcrackers and Steller's jays by sound alone. I watched a family of mountain goats pick their way across a cliff face on the next ridge, their movements so precise and unhurried it was like watching something choreographed. I took another weather reading at noon, another at 4, another at 8. Evening report to dispatch, dinner, sunset, sleep. I talked to Gary on Channel 3 a few times. He had a voice like gravel in a coffee can, slow and deliberate, and he'd been manning Ward Peak for 19 seasons. He told me about the lookout's history, how Sheephead Point had been continuously staffed since 1933, except for a few years in the 70s, when the Forest Service experimented with automated detection systems that didn't work. He told me about fire behavior, about how you could read the mood of a fire by the color and shape of its smoke column, about how a plume that went from white to gray to brown meant a surface fire was crowning into the canopy. about how a column that leaned hard meant wind-driven fire, and you needed to pay attention to where it was heading. He told me about the time in 2000 when the whole Bitterroot burned, when the sky went orange for weeks, and ash fell on the lookout like gray snow, and he could hear the fire at night. A sound, he said, was like a freight train, breathing. I liked talking to Gary. He didn't ask personal questions. He didn't try to be my friend. He just shared what he knew and then signed off. It was the exact right kind of human contact. On the 8th night, I saw the first signal. I need to be specific about this because I've gone over it in my mind so many times now that I need to be careful about what I actually remember versus what I've reconstructed. It was around 11 at night. I know this because I'd checked my watch before getting into my sleeping bag, and I hadn't been asleep yet. I was lying on the cot, with my eyes open, listening to the wind, which had picked up after sunset the way it often did. The cab was dark. The shutters were closed on 3 sides, but I'd left the south-facing ones open because I liked to watch the stars from the cot, and the south face caught less wind. Through the open shutters, across the dark shapes of the ridges to the south, I saw a light. It wasn't a fire. A fire at night, even a small one, has a particular quality. It flickers, it's warm, it casts upward illumination. This was a steady, cold point of light. White, maybe slightly blue-white. It appeared on what I estimated to be a ridgeline about 7 or 8 miles to the south-southwest, in an area I knew from the topo maps was deep wilderness. No roads. No trails that I was aware of. No structures. It was on for perhaps 4 seconds. Then it went off. Then, about 3 seconds later, it came on again. Stayed for 4 seconds. Off. 3 seconds. On. 4 seconds. Off. This pattern repeated 6 times. Then it stopped. I sat up in the cot and stared at the dark ridge for a long time. Nothing. The stars. The wind. The black shapes of the mountains. I told myself it was a hiker with a headlamp. Maybe someone night hiking along a ridge, their light appearing intermittent because of terrain features, trees blocking the beam at intervals. It was unusual to be that deep in the Bitterroot at night without being on a maintained trail, but not impossible. Elk hunters sometimes went deep. Trail runners did stupid things. It was a reasonable explanation, and I accepted it, and eventually I went to sleep. The next morning during my 8 o'clock check-in, I mentioned it to dispatch, almost as an afterthought. I said I'd seen an intermittent light to the south-southwest, around 2300. Wondered if there were any backcountry permits issued for that area. The dispatcher that morning wasn't Darlene. It was a younger guy named Russ, who handled weekday morning shifts. He said he'd check and get back to me. He never did, and I forgot about it. 4 nights later, I saw it again. Same direction, south-southwest, same ridgeline, or close to it. Same time, give or take, somewhere around 11. This time I was on the catwalk, standing in the dark because I'd come out to look at the Milky Way, which on clear nights in the Bitterroot is so vivid and dense that it looks like someone spilled something luminous across the sky. I was leaning on the railing, looking south, and the light appeared. Same steady, cold white point, same pattern. On for 4 seconds, off for 3, on for 4, off for 3. But this time it repeated more. I counted. It did this 14 times before it stopped. I watched the spot for another 20 minutes. Nothing. This time I couldn't as easily dismiss it. Same location, same timing, same pattern. Hikers don't repeat the same pattern of headlamp flashes with mechanical precision on 2 different nights from the same remote ridgeline. I went inside and pulled out the topo map and spread it on the table under my headlamp. I used the Osborne Firefinder's azimuth ring by memory, estimating the bearing to the light at roughly 210 degrees. I followed that line on the map across the terrain to the south-southwest. The ridgeline at the right distance, 7 to 8 miles out, was a feature the map labeled as Dome Peak, a nondescript high point At about 7,200 feet, there was nothing there. No trail. No old lookout. No mining claim marked on the map. Just wilderness. In the morning, I mentioned it to dispatch again, this time to Darlene. I described the light, the pattern, the bearing, the estimated distance. There was a pause on the radio that lasted long enough for me to think the signal had dropped. "Copy that, sheephead," Darlene said. "I'll make a note. Probably someone with a signal mirror or a headlamp. Gets reflected off rock faces out there sometimes. The quartzite catches light in funny ways." "At 11 at night?" I said. "There's no light source to reflect." Another pause. "Could be someone camping who doesn't know they're visible. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Keep an eye on it and let us know if it continues." I said copy and signed off. Her explanation didn't make sense, and she had to have known it didn't make sense. But I also didn't know what else to say. It was a light on a ridge. It wasn't a fire. It wasn't my job to investigate mysterious lights. My job was to watch for smoke. But I watched for the light too, now. I couldn't help it. It didn't appear the next night, or the night after that. 5 nights of nothing. I started to think it had been some odd atmospheric artifact, or a satellite catching at a low angle, or something with an explanation I simply didn't have the information to determine. I let it go. I returned to the routine: weather readings, radio check-ins, scanning the timber. I read a battered copy of A River Runs Through It that I found on the shelf. I watched thunderstorms build over the divide in the afternoons, great churning towers of cumulus that would go gray and then dark and then split open with lightning, and I'd track the strikes on the map and watch the ridges for the thin white threads of smoke that sometimes appeared in the hours after a storm passed. On the 14th night, it came back. This time was different. I was in the cab, awake but in the cot, and I happened to be facing south. The light appeared at its usual bearing, but this time, after the standard pattern on 4, off 3, on 4, off 3, it did something new. After 6 repetitions of the regular pattern, it paused for about 10 seconds. Then it did a rapid series of short flashes. Quick, maybe half a second each, with half-second gaps. I counted 7 of them. Then, the long pattern resumed. I got out of the cot and moved to the south window and watched. The long pattern continued for another 8 cycles. Then, the 10-second pause again. Then, rapid short flashes, this time 5 of them. Then the long pattern. Then the pause. Then 9 rapid flashes. I was standing there with my forehead nearly pressed against the cold glass, and a feeling had started in my stomach that I can only describe as the sensation of understanding arriving before understanding itself. My body knew something before my mind assembled it. The pattern wasn't random. It wasn't a headlamp being clicked on and off by a bored hiker. It was structured. The long flashes were one thing. The short flashes were another. The pauses were separators. It was a signal. Not in the vague sense that any repeating light is a signal. It was deliberate, intentional, organized. Someone or something was transmitting information from a dark ridge in the middle of the wilderness, and from what I could tell, it was pointed at me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the table with the topo map and my logbook, and I wrote down everything I could remember about the pattern. I tried to see if it was Morse code, but it didn't map cleanly onto any Morse I could recall, and my knowledge of Morse was limited to SOS and a few letters I'd learned as a kid in Scouts. The long flashes could be dashes, and the short flashes could be dots. But the groupings didn't correspond to standard alphanumeric Morse, as far as I could tell. Whatever language the signal was using, it wasn't one I recognized. At 8 in the morning, I called Darlene and reported it. I was more detailed this time. I described the pattern, the timing, the variation, the apparent structure. I said I believed someone was deliberately signaling from the vicinity of Dome Peak, and I thought it warranted investigation. Darlene listened. Then she said, Sheephead, we appreciate the thoroughness. We'll pass this along to the wilderness ranger when he's in the area. There's no access road to that part of the forest, so it would be a significant commitment to send someone in. Most likely it's a backcountry camper with a light, but we'll keep it on file. I said, copy. I didn't push it, but something had shifted in the way I occupied the lookout. Before the light, the tower had felt like a sanctuary, elevated, removed, safe in its isolation. Now the isolation had a different quality. I was high and visible and exposed. Anything in the surrounding wilderness could see my tower, and one thing, at least, was looking. I started paying attention to details I'd been ignoring. The logbook from previous observers, for instance. There was a shelf of them going back decades. Green hardcover Forest Service notebooks with dates on the spines. I'd glanced at them when I arrived, but hadn't read them. Now I pulled them down and started going through them, starting with the most recent and working backward. The previous season's logbook was from an observer named Tomas Garza. His entries were neat and professional. Weather readings, smoke reports, maintenance notes, routine. But in mid-August, about 2/3 of the way through the book, I found an entry that made me stop. 2,347. Light obs to SSW, approx bearing 210. Steady white-blue pulsing pattern. Duration, approx 3 minutes. No associated smoke or fire behavior. Noted for record. 2 days later, 2,315. Light obs. SSW repeated. Same bearing. Pattern similar, possibly varied from previous. No fire. No known activity in area per dispatch. 5 days after that, 2,330. SSW light again. Longer duration tonight. Approx 8 minutes. Pattern. Includes rapid flashes between longer pulses. Reported to dispatch. They advised probable camper or equipment reflection. Does not resemble any reflection I have seen in 2 seasons of observation. Then, 10 days later, a longer entry. Have been watching SSW light nightly when visible. It does not appear every night. Appears roughly every 3 to 5 nights. Pattern is becoming more complex. I have begun recording the sequences, discussed with Gary at Ward Peak. Gary says he cannot see the light from his position. Says to be careful about ridge fixation, a phenomenon where observers focus on a visual anomaly and begin to see pattern where there is none. I respect Gary, but I am certain this is not that. The sequences are structured. I believe they are directed at this tower. After that, Garza's entries became shorter and less detailed. His weather readings continued normally, but the personal notes thinned out. There were no more mentions of the light. The last 3 weeks of his logbook were pure data. Temperature, humidity, wind, sky condition. Nothing else. No observations, no commentary, no human voice at all. I went back further. The logbook from 2 seasons prior belonged to someone named Chris Alderman. Alderman's book was more casual, full of bird sightings and complaints about pack rats getting into the food cache. There was no mention of any light. But Alderman had only stayed through August before leaving early for what the logbook described as personal reasons. There were no further details. 3 seasons back, an observer named Dale Purcell. Purcell's logbook was meticulous, almost obsessively detailed. Weather readings recorded to the 10th of a degree, wind observations that included not just speed and direction but character. Words like gusty, laminar, channeling through drainage. Purcell clearly loved the work. And in late July, buried in a passage about cloud formations, this. Anomalous light, SSW, approx, bearing 208 to 212, repeating signal pattern, have seen 3 times this week. Unfamiliar, reporting to district. And then, 2 weeks later, have discontinued observation of the SSW light per district recommendation. focusing on primary duties. S. Per district recommendation. That phrase sat in my mind like a stone in a shoe. Darlene hadn't recommended I stop watching. She'd told me to keep an eye on it. But someone, at some point, had told Dale Purcell to stop looking. And Purcell, who documented everything, who recorded wind character and cloud genus and the feeding behaviors of Clark's nutcrackers, had simply stopped. No further mention, no curiosity, no follow-up. From a man who had opinions about the laminar qualities of morning wind. I went back further. 5 seasons, 8 seasons, 12. The logbooks got older. The handwriting changed. The paper yellowed. And in roughly half of the books I checked, I found some variation of the same observation. A light to the south-southwest. A repeating pattern. A bearing that was always somewhere between 208 and 215 degrees. Always at night. Always in the same general area. Always described as steady, cold, white, or blue-white. Always pulsing. Always structured. The earliest mention I could find was from 1987. An observer named Helen Vasquez had written, "Persistent light signal, SSW, Dome PK area, 3rd night observed, flashing in groups. Not campfire, not aircraft, not lightning," reported to Sula. They said, "Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it." That phrase appeared, in one form or another, in almost every logbook that mentioned the light. I put the books back on the shelf and sat in the chair and looked south through the window. It was mid-afternoon. The ridgeline where the light appeared was visible, a dark forested hump against the sky, unremarkable, indistinguishable from 100 other ridges. In daylight it looked like nothing, just trees and rock and distance. I radioed Gary. "Ward Peak, this is Sheephead. You on?" It took a minute. Then his gravel voice came back. "Sheephead, Ward Peak. Go ahead. Gary, I want to ask you something, and I'd appreciate a straight answer." "I'll do my best." "The light to the south-southwest, Dome Peak area. You've heard about it before, from other observers." A pause, longer than radio delay. Then, "I've heard mention of it, yeah. You told Garza last year it was ridge fixation. I told Garza to be careful. There's a difference. Have you ever seen it yourself?" "Sheephead, I'm 14 miles north of you and Ward Peak faces east. My sightline to that area is blocked by about 3 ridges and 20,000 acres of timber. So no, I haven't seen it. But you know about it. I know observers have reported it. Goes back a while. The district is aware." "And what does the district say about it?" "Same thing they always say. Probably campers. Probably reflections. Probably atmospheric. Nothing to be concerned about." "Do you believe that?" Another pause. I could hear the wind noise in his transmission, a soft hiss under his voice. "I believe," he said slowly, "that there are things in the backcountry that don't have convenient explanations, and that most of the time, the best thing you can do is note them and not let them interfere with the work. You're up there to watch for fire. The light isn't fire." That's about all I'd say. "That's not really an answer, Gary." "No," he said. "It's not. Ward Peak clear." I sat with the radio in my hand for a while after that. Then I put it down and went out on the catwalk and took my 4 o'clock weather reading. 67 degrees. Relative humidity, 31%. Wind southwest at 8 to 12. Scattered cumulus. Bases at about 12,000 feet. I wrote it all down. I did my job. But that night I set an alarm for 10:30 and positioned myself at the south window with the mounted binoculars adjusted to the bearing of Dome Peak, and I waited. At 11:08, the light appeared. Through the binoculars it was brighter and more defined than with the naked eye, but it still didn't resolve into anything identifiable. It wasn't a flashlight beam. It wasn't a lantern. It had no visible source structure, no cone of illumination, no scatter. It was just a point. A cold, steady, bright point that occupied one precise location on the ridge and turned on and off in its pattern. I had a notebook open on the sill, and I recorded every flash. Long flash, I marked with a dash. Short flash, I marked with a dot. Pauses longer than 5 seconds, I marked with a slash. The sequence that night was long, 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 long. Short, 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 short. Long, 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 long. Short, 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 short. Long, 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 long. Long, long, long. Short, short, short. Long, 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 long. Long, long, long. I stared at my transcription. If the longs were one element, and the shorts were another, and the pauses were breaks, then the signal was transmitting groups of numbers. 6, 8, 4, 3, 9, 2, 7. Numbers. The signal was sending numbers. I spent the next day trying to figure out what the numbers meant. Coordinates were the obvious guess, but I couldn't make any reasonable coordinate format out of the sequences I'd recorded. It wasn't a phone number. It wasn't a date that I could recognize. I tried assigning the numbers to letters alphabetically. 684, 3927. FHDCIBG. Meaningless. I tried it in pairs, in triplets, in different combinations. Nothing coherent emerged. I considered the possibility that I was wrong about the numbers, that what I was interpreting as counted groups were actually something else entirely. But the pattern was so clean, so precise in its timing, that I kept coming back to the counting. Each long flash was exactly the same duration. Each short flash was exactly the same duration. Each pause was exactly the same duration. Whatever was producing this signal was not human hands on a flashlight button. The precision was mechanical. Or at least, it exceeded the consistency of any human action I could imagine someone maintaining voluntarily. I didn't report this observation to dispatch. I'm not sure exactly when I made that decision, or why. Part of it was that I felt I'd already reported it multiple times and received the same dismissive response. Part of it was something else, something less rational. The logbooks had shown me that every observer who reported the light was told not to worry about it. Some were told to stop watching. And every single one of them, without exception, had eventually gone quiet about it. They'd either stopped watching, stopped reporting, or stopped writing about it. Something about that pattern of silencing felt deliberate in a way that made me reluctant to feed more information into it. So I watched on my own. The light appeared again 3 nights later. Same time, same bearing, same precision. This time the sequence was different. 5, 3, 7, 1, 8, 6, 2. New numbers, same format. I recorded them. I added them to my growing chart. 2 nights after that, again, 9, 4, 1, 6, 3, 5, 8. I was accumulating data without understanding it. Each sequence was 7 numbers long. Each number was between 1 and 9. No number repeated within a single sequence. It was like watching someone send a shuffled set of the digits 1 through 9, minus 1 or 2, every few nights. But that didn't mean anything to me either. During the days I was still doing my job, I spotted 2 smokes that week, both small, both from lightning strikes 2 days prior. I reported their locations and watched them through the binoculars until they either went out on their own or a crew was dispatched. The fires were real and tangible, and within the scope of what I was trained to do, and working them felt grounding, like returning to solid land after swimming in deep water. But as soon as the sun went down, my attention swung south. I started sleeping less, not from anxiety, exactly, but from a kind of intellectual compulsion. The signal was a puzzle, and my mind wouldn't let it go. I'd lie on the cot trying to sleep, and find myself running numbers, trying combinations, looking for the key. I lost weight because I was forgetting to eat full meals, snacking on crackers and peanut butter instead of cooking the canned food in my supplies. The routine was still there, the weather readings, the radio check-ins, the scanning, but it had become mechanical. The real work, the work that consumed me, was happening at night. On the 22nd night of observation, the signal changed. Not the numbers, the light itself. It appeared at its usual time and bearing, but halfway through the sequence, a second light appeared. This one was to the left of the first, separated by what I estimated through the binoculars to be about 200 yards. It was the same color, the same quality, the same cold white-blue point. But it pulsed at a different rhythm. The first light continued its numerical sequence. The second light pulsed in a steady, unchanging rhythm. On 2 seconds, off 2 seconds. On 2 seconds, off 2 seconds. A metronome. I watched them both for 12 minutes. The first light completed its sequence and went dark. The second light continued for another 3 minutes. Then it too went dark. 2 lights. 2 different patterns. On a dark ridge in the roadless wilderness, 8 miles from the nearest trail. I need to pause here and acknowledge something, because honesty matters, and I want whoever hears this to understand the state I was in. I was not sleeping well. I was not eating well. I was spending hours each night staring at a point of light on a dark ridge and transcribing what I believed to be numerical sequences. I was alone. I had been alone for weeks. I was aware, in the clinical, detached way you're aware of a slow leak in a tire, that my judgment might not be fully reliable. Gary's warning about ridge fixation was in the back of my mind constantly. The psychological literature on isolation and pattern recognition is clear. Human beings in solitary conditions with reduced sensory input will find patterns in noise, will find meaning in randomness, will construct elaborate, interpretive frameworks around stimuli that have no actual structure. I knew this. I had a degree in geography. I understood data artifacts. But I also understood what I was seeing. The light was real. The patterns were real. The precision was real. And the second light was new. And it was different from the first. And both had appeared in the same location at the same time with different rhythmic signatures, which meant that this was not one anomaly, but a system of at least 2 coordinated anomalies. You don't get that from ridge fixation. You don't hallucinate 2 independent but coordinated light sources with distinct pulse signatures. Whatever was happening on Dome Peak was real, and it was getting more complex. The mule team came with my 2-week resupply on a Thursday. 2 Forest Service packers led 4 mules up the trail, loaded with food, propane, batteries, and a few personal items I'd requested: books, a notebook, a warmer jacket for the cold nights that were starting to creep in as July advanced. The packers were a married couple named Hank and Deborah, leathery and cheerful and clearly accustomed to the routine. They unloaded the supplies, checked the propane connection, asked how I was doing. I said, "Fine." They stayed for about an hour and then headed back down. I almost asked them about the light. I had the question formed in my mouth as Deborah was tightening a cinch strap on one of the mules. I was going to ask it casually, the way you'd ask about a local landmark, something like, "Hey, has anyone ever mentioned seeing lights over near Dome Peak?" But I didn't ask. And the reason I didn't ask is that as I was forming the question, Hank said something to Deborah that stopped me. He said, "Radio's been acting up down at Sula. Dispatch had some weird interference last few days. Russ thinks it's atmospheric, but it's got that same pattern as before." Deborah said, and kept working on the strap. Same pattern as before. I let them leave. And then I stood on the catwalk and watched them descend the trail until they disappeared into the tree line. And I thought about what same pattern as before meant. It meant this had happened before. It meant the radio interference at dispatch was a known phenomenon. It meant Hank was aware of it. It meant it was familiar enough to be described in relation to a previous occurrence rather than as something new. And nobody had mentioned it to me. The way nobody had mentioned the light to me. The way nobody had told me that a dozen observers before me had seen the same thing and been told the same thing and eventually gone quiet about it. I was starting to feel the shape of something I couldn't see. Like being in a dark room and knowing the dimensions of the space by the echoes of your own breathing. There was a structure here, an architecture of silence, of deflection, of managed awareness. The light was known. The interference was known. The pattern of observers noticing and then stopping was known, and the institutional response was consistent and unchanging. Acknowledge minimally, reassure blandly, and wait for the observer to stop asking. I need to tell you about what happened next, and I want to be precise, because this is where things began to slide. 5 nights after the resupply, I saw the light again. Both points were active. The first was running its numerical sequence. The second was pulsing its steady metronome rhythm. I was at the window with the binoculars, transcribing, and at approximately 11:20, a third light appeared. This one wasn't on Dome Peak. This one was behind me, to the north. I didn't see it directly. What I saw was a change in the quality of light inside the cab. A faint rhythmic brightening and dimming of the shadows on the south wall, which meant a light source was coming through the north windows behind me. My body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I turned around slowly. Through the north-facing windows, on a ridge I estimated to be about 5 miles out, a light was pulsing. Same cold white blue, same steady, mechanical precision. But its pattern was different from both of the southern lights. This one pulsed in groups of 3. 3 flashes, pause. 3 flashes, pause. 3 flashes, pause. I was surrounded. Not physically, not in any tactical or threatening way that I could articulate, but the geometry of the situation had changed fundamentally. Before, the signal was something I watched from safety, a distant anomaly on a far ridge, contained by the distance between us. Now, there were signals on both sides of me. The lookout was no longer a vantage point. It was a position between 2 points of a larger pattern. I wasn't observing the system. I was inside it. I stood in the center of the cab and turned slowly, looking north, then south, north, then south. The lights pulsed in their separate rhythms, unsynchronized but simultaneous. The first light on Dome Peak ran its numbers. The second light on Dome Peak kept its metronome. The new light to the north pulsed in 3s. They were all different, but they were all present, all active, all operating in the same window of time, and the only common feature of their geometry was my tower. I was the center point. I did something then that I can't fully explain, because the impulse came from somewhere below conscious thought. I picked up my headlamp, went out onto the catwalk, aimed it toward the southern ridge, and turned it on and off, 3 times, slow. All 3 lights stopped simultaneously. Not faded, not wound down. They stopped, instantly, perfectly, as if a switch had been thrown. The ridges went dark. The only light was the stars and the faint glow of my headlamp, still in my hand. I stood on the catwalk in the dark for what must have been 10 minutes, shaking in a way that I couldn't control, not from cold. The shaking was neurological, adrenaline, a deep mammalian alarm that had nothing to do with rational assessment. I'd communicated with the lights, and they'd responded. Or I'd interrupted them and they'd gone silent, or I'd been noticed and they'd shut down. I didn't know which interpretation was correct, but every one of them was terrifying. I went inside and locked the shutters, all 4 sides, and sat on the cot in the dark with my back against the wall and the radio in my lap. I didn't call dispatch. I didn't call Gary. I sat there until dawn turned the shutters gray and then gold, and then I opened them, and the mountains were there, unchanged, indifferent, beautiful in the morning light. And nothing on any ridge, in any direction, showed any sign that anything had happened. I took my weather readings. I called dispatch. Sheephead, morning report, 51 degrees, humidity 44%, wind calm, sky clear. My voice sounded normal. Darlene said copy. The day proceeded. I did not sleep that night, or the next. On the third night, I slept for about 2 hours out of pure exhaustion, a shallow, brittle sleep full of half-formed images. I dreamed about standing in the cab and seeing lights on every ridge, 360 degrees, the entire horizon pulsing in coordinated patterns, and in the dream I understood the pattern. I could read it the way you read a sentence. But when I woke up, the understanding was gone, and all that remained was the nausea of a meaning I'd held and lost. I started keeping 2 logbooks. The Green Forest Service book got the official data: temperature, humidity, wind, smoke observations, clean and professional, and exactly what dispatch expected. The second book, my personal notebook, got everything else: the light sequences, the timings, the bearings, my attempts at interpretation, my descriptions of the patterns, and, increasingly, my observations of things I was noticing during the day that I hadn't paid attention to before. Like the birds. I mentioned that I'd learned to identify several species by sound: Clark's nutcrackers, Steller's jays, mountain chickadees, red-breasted nuthatches. The soundscape of the lookout was rich and consistent, a reliable morning chorus that I'd come to know as well as I knew the topography. But sometime in the 3rd week of July, the character of the bird activity near the tower changed. It took me a few days to consciously register what I was sensing. The birds hadn't left. They were still present, still visible, still vocalizing, but their patterns had shifted. The nutcrackers, which normally foraged in the whitebark pines below the tower in loose, noisy groups, had started flying in more regular formations. I'd stand on the catwalk and watch them move between trees, and they'd fly in evenly spaced sequences: one bird, pause, one bird, pause, one bird, pause, like a pulse. I wrote it down in my notebook, and then immediately wrote below it: "This is what ridge fixation looks like. I am seeing pattern in bird flight. This is not significant." But I kept watching. And one morning I timed the intervals between nutcracker flights from a particular snag to a particular pine, and the intervals were 4.1 seconds, 4 seconds, 4.1 seconds, 3.9 seconds, 4 seconds, 4.1 seconds, 4 seconds, 4 seconds, the same duration as the long flashes in the signal. I put the notebook down and went inside and sat in the chair and pressed my hands flat on the table and breathed. I told myself that I was tired, that I was underslept and underfed and alone, and that my pattern recognition systems were in overdrive, finding signal in noise, seeing the number 4 in bird flight because I'd been staring at the number 4 in light flashes for weeks. The human brain is a pattern completion engine. Give it a target, and it will find that target everywhere: in clouds, in static, in the random movements of wild animals. This is known. This is documented. This is what happens. I believed this rationally, but I also couldn't stop watching. The next resupply was due in 3 days. I decided I would go down with the mule team. I would hike out to the trailhead, drive to Sula, talk to Darlene in person, tell her everything I'd observed, show her my notebook, and ask for a direct, honest conversation about what was happening. If she told me it was nothing, I'd accept it. If she told me I was losing my grip, I'd accept that too. But I needed to talk to another human being face to face, and I needed to see their eyes when they answered me. The mule team didn't come. On the scheduled resupply day, nothing. I waited all morning. I scanned the trail through the binoculars. No mules, no packers, no dust on the switchbacks. At noon, I radioed dispatch. Sula dispatch, Sheephead. No response. Sula dispatch, Sheephead Point, do you copy? Static, but not clean static. There was something in it, a faint rhythmic texture, a pattern in the noise that rose and fell at intervals. I adjusted the squelch. The pattern persisted. I changed to Channel 3. Same thing. Channel 6. Same thing. Every channel carried the same low, pulsing static, like a heartbeat buried in white noise. I tried again every 30 minutes for the rest of the day. No voice response on any channel, just the pulsing static. At 8 in the evening, I tried Gary. Ward Peak, Sheephead. Gary, are you there? Nothing. Then, after about 15 seconds, Gary's voice. But wrong. It was Gary's voice in the way that a photocopy is the original document. The tonal quality was there, the gravel, the slow cadence, but there was something underneath it that I couldn't identify, a flatness, a mechanical quality, as if someone were reading Gary's words from a transcript rather than speaking them. Sheephead, Ward Peak, I'm here. Gary, I can't reach dispatch. Have you been in contact with Sula today? Contact has been intermittent. Atmospheric conditions are affecting radio propagation. It should clear up in a day or two. My resupply didn't arrive. Sometimes the schedule shifts. They'll send someone when conditions allow. Gary, are you okay? I'm fine. Everything is normal. Focus on your duties, Sheephead. Take your readings. Watch for smoke. Don't worry about the rest. Don't worry about it. The same phrase. The exact same institutional dismissal, spoken in Gary's voice but stripped of Gary's character. Gary, who told stories about the 2000 fires, who had opinions about weather patterns, who called me kid sometimes when he was being avuncular. This Gary sounded like a recording designed to produce calmness. The words were appropriate, but the person behind them was absent. Gary, I said, what do you know about the light on Dome Peak? A pause. 5 seconds. 10. There is no light on Dome Peak, he said. The radio went silent. I stood there, holding the handset, and I felt something happening inside my chest. A physical sensation like a key turning in a lock, a mechanism engaging. Fear, yes. But also a crystalline clarity that comes when the last ambiguity is removed from a situation. I had been telling myself for weeks that there were benign explanations, hikers, reflections, atmospheric phenomena, pattern-seeking brains, institutional indifference, all reasonable, all plausible. But there is no light on Dome Peak, spoken by a voice that sounded like Gary but wasn't Gary, after weeks of logs from years of observers who had all seen the same thing, that closed the last door on reasonable. Something was real. Something was structured. Something was operating in the wilderness around my tower, and whatever institutional apparatus was supposed to be supporting me was either compromised by it, complicit with it, or indistinguishable from it. I had food for about 10 days if I rationed. I had water from a spring-fed cistern below the tower that was gravity-fed to a spigot in the cab. I had batteries. I had the radio, for whatever it was worth. And I had the trail, 9 miles down to the forest road, 10 more miles to Highway 93, and then, theoretically, the rest of the world. I decided to leave at first light. I packed that night. Everything I needed in my backpack: food, water, first aid kit, headlamp, the notebook. I left the radio. I wasn't sure why, but the thought of carrying it with me, of having that pulsing static close to my body, produced a revulsion I didn't try to override. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. and lay down on the cot. At 11:04, the lights came on. All of them. Not 3, not 4. I counted 9. They were arranged in a rough circle around the tower, on ridges and high points at varying distances, 5 to 10 miles out, spanning the full 360 degrees of the horizon. 9 cold white-blue points, pulsing in 9 different patterns, some running numerical sequences, some in steady rhythms, some in patterns I couldn't categorize. The cab filled with the reflected light of their synchronized activity, pale and shifting, and the shadows on the walls moved in complex interference patterns as the different pulse rates overlapped and separated. I stood in the center of the cab and watched. I was past fear, or through it, into a state that I don't have a good word for. Receptive, maybe. open. The part of me that had been trying to explain and rationalize and categorize had exhausted itself, and what remained was the older, simpler part that just watches and records. The 9 lights pulsed for approximately 20 minutes. Then, as I watched, they began to synchronize. The different patterns gradually aligned, the way a room full of metronomes on a shared surface will eventually swing together. Over the course of about 5 minutes, the 9 independent rhythms converged into a single, unified pulse, all 9 lights flashing in unison. On, off, in perfect synchrony. A ring of light around my tower, breathing as one. And then the unified pulse began to slow. The interval between flashes lengthened, on for 4 seconds, off for 4 seconds, on for 5, off for 5, on for 7, off for 7, on for 10, off for 10. The ring of light breathing slower and slower, as if something enormous were falling asleep, and I felt my own breathing matching it, slowing, deepening, my heart rate dropping, my vision softening, the edges of the cab going gray and indistinct. I caught myself. I don't know how else to describe it. I caught myself the way you catch yourself nodding off at the wheel. A sudden jolt of awareness, a recognition that my consciousness had been moving somewhere without my consent. The slowing pulse was doing something to me. It was a physiological intervention. It was changing my state, and I had been letting it. I broke eye contact with the lights. I turned away from the windows and stared at the floor and squeezed my hands into fists until my fingernails bit into my palms and the pain brought me fully back. My breathing was shallow and fast now, compensating. I did not look up. I felt the light still pulsing through the cab, the shadows still moving on the floor, but I kept my eyes on the wood grain between my boots, and I held my mind where I could feel it, and I did not let go. After some time, I don't know how long, the shadows stopped moving. The light was gone. I looked up. The mountains were dark. The stars were out. The ridges were empty. I did not sleep. I sat in the chair with my packed backpack at my feet, and I watched the darkness, and I waited for dawn. At first light, I left. The descent was fast. I was moving with the energy of escape, practically jogging the switchbacks, my pack bouncing on my hips. The morning was clear and cool, and the forest around me was normal, alive with birdsong and wind in the canopy, and the green smell of conifers warming in the early sun. Nothing was wrong. Everything was exactly as it should be in a Montana wilderness on a July morning. The wrongness was above me, behind me, in the tower, in the night, and with every step downhill, I felt the distance growing between me and it, and the weight in my chest eased. I reached the trailhead in just under 4 hours. My truck was where I'd left it. I threw my pack in the bed and drove the washboard road to the highway, and then turned north toward Sula. The ranger station was 40 minutes away. I drove with the windows down and the noise of the road filling the cab, and I felt a kind of feral relief, the animal satisfaction of having gotten away. The ranger station parking lot was empty, except for one Forest Service truck. I went inside. The front desk was unmanned. The office beyond it was quiet. I walked down the hall to Darlene's office, and the door was open, but she wasn't there. Her desk was neat. Her computer was off. The screensaver was showing a rotating Forest Service shield. I said hello. No response. I walked through the building. The radio room was in the back, a small space with a dispatch console, a bank of radio equipment, a wheeled chair, a coffee maker. The equipment was on. The console display showed all channels active, but the chair was empty, and the coffee maker was cold. I stood in the radio room and looked at the console. On the desk beside it was a green hardcover logbook, identical to the one at the lookout. I opened it. It was a dispatch log, entries recording incoming radio traffic from the lookout network. Sheephead Point, Ward Peak, and several other lookouts I hadn't heard of. Names like Burnt Knob, Sweeney Peak, Gash Point. Each entry noted the time, the station, and a brief summary of the communication. I flipped to the most recent pages. The entries stopped 4 days ago. The last entry read, 0800, Sheephead Point. Morning report received. Routine. 4 days. No entries for 4 days. But I'd been calling in every morning. I'd heard Darlene acknowledge my reports. I'd heard her say, copy. Hadn't I? I tried to remember. I tried to remember the specific voice, the specific words, the specific quality of the dispatch responses I'd been receiving. And I found that I couldn't isolate them. The morning check-ins had become so routine, so automatic, that the actual content of the exchanges had blurred into a general impression of normalcy. I said my readings. A voice said copy. Was it always the same voice? Was it always Darlene? Was it always a voice at all? Or had it become, at some point, just the sound of the radio confirming what I expected to hear? I put the logbook down and left the building. I got in my truck. I sat in the parking lot for a long time, watching the empty highway, the quiet building, the Forest Service flag hanging limp on its pole in the still morning air. I should have driven to Missoula. I should have driven to the nearest town with a sheriff's office and people and noise and cell service, and told someone, anyone, everything. That's what a rational person does. That's what a person who is winning the fight against whatever was happening does. They leave. I drove back to the trailhead. I don't know how to explain why. I've tried. I've tried to construct a rational narrative for my decision, and I can't. The best I can do is describe the feeling. It was the feeling of having a word on the tip of your tongue, magnified to the scale of your entire life. There was something I almost understood, the numbers, the patterns, the synchronization, the way the lights had slowed and my breathing had matched them, and my consciousness had started to drift somewhere. I had been close to something, not close to danger, though it was dangerous, close to comprehension, close to understanding what the signal was and what it meant, and why it had been pulsing on that ridge since at least 1987, and probably longer, and why the Forest Service knew about it and managed it with silence, and why observers saw it and then stopped seeing it, stopped asking, stopped writing. I wanted to know. The curiosity was a physical force, as real as gravity, and it pulled me back up the mountain. The hike back to the tower took 5.5 hours, because I was slower now, tired, carrying the weight of everything I knew and didn't know. I reached the lookout in the late afternoon. Everything was as I'd left it. The shutters were open. The Osborne firefinder stood on its pedestal. The cot was unmade. The radio sat on the table where I'd left it. I picked it up and turned it on. The pulsing static was still there, softer now, barely audible under the squelch, but present. I set up for the night. I ate. I took my evening weather readings, more out of habit than obligation. And then I opened my notebook and looked at all the number sequences I'd recorded, and I tried, one more time, to find the key. 7 sequences, each 7 numbers long, each containing the digits 1 through 9 with 2 digits missing. I wrote them out. 6, 8, 4, 3, 9, 2, 7, missing 1, and 5, 5, 3, 7, 1, 8, 6, 2, missing 4, and 9, 9, 4, 1, 6, 3, 5, 8 missing, 2, and 7. I stared at the missing numbers. From the first 3 sequences, 1, 5, 4, 9, 2, 7. I wrote the missing pairs in order. 15, 49, 27. Then I stopped writing, because my hand had started to shake. Sheephead Point. Latitude, 45.8, 7, give or take. But the numbers could also be a frequency, 154.927 megahertzes. I didn't know, or they could be nothing. They could be 3 2-digit numbers pulled from the gaps in random sequences, given meaning by a desperate mind in an empty tower. But I picked up the radio and turned it to manual frequency entry. which the Bendix King allowed if you knew how to override the preset channels. I punched in 154.927 megahertzes. I pressed the monitor button. Clear signal, no static, no pulsing, dead silence, and then a tone. A single sustained tone, like a test of the emergency broadcast system, but lower, deeper, almost subaudible, more felt than heard. A vibration in the bones of my hand where I held the radio, in my jaw, in the base of my skull. And then a voice. Not Gary's voice, not Darlene's voice, not any human voice I could characterize. It was composite, layered, as if multiple voices were speaking the same words at the same fractional offset, creating a choral effect that was almost, but not quite synchronized. The words were clear. Sheephead. Confirm receipt. I keyed the transmit button. My thumb pressed it before my brain authorized the action. Sheephead confirms, I said. Signal alignment is at 87%. Final calibration requires direct observation. Proceed to Dome Peak, bearing 210. Begin at nightfall. Who is this? I said. Proceed to Dome Peak, bearing 210. Begin at nightfall. This is your final task for the season. I'm not going to Dome Peak. Who is this? What is this frequency? The tone returned. The voice was gone. I switched back to the main channels. The pulsing static was still there. I turned the radio off and put it down. Final task for the season. As if this were part of the job. As if monitoring the signal, recording the numbers, finding the frequency. And now, walking 8 miles through the wilderness, in the dark to a ridge, with no trail, was simply the last item on a checklist that I'd been following all along without knowing it. And the worst part, the part that made me sit down on the cot and put my face in my hands, was that I could feel the pull, the same pull that had brought me back up the mountain instead of driving to Missoula. The same pull that had kept me at the window night after night transcribing numbers. The same pull that had slowed my breathing when the lights synchronized. It was in me. Whatever the signal was doing, it had been doing it for weeks. And it wasn't just external, it was internal. The calibration the voice mentioned wasn't the calibration of equipment on a ridge. It was the calibration of me. I thought about the observers in the logbooks, the ones who stopped writing, the ones who stopped asking questions, the ones who came for one season and didn't come back. Had they received this message? Had they gone to Dome Peak? Had they walked into the dark on bearing 210 and found whatever was waiting there? Or had they resisted the way I was trying to resist and simply left and lived the rest of their lives with the knowledge that something had tried to call them and they hadn't answered? And Garza, Tomas Garza, who had recorded the light in careful detail and then gone silent for his last 3 weeks, and then hadn't returned. His logbook entries at the end, the pure data, the absence of voice, had that been the silence of a man who'd stopped caring? Or the silence of a man who'd gone to Dome Peak and come back different? Nightfall came. I watched it through the south-facing window. The light drained from the sky in that slow Montana way, pink to purple to indigo to the deep, clear black of mountain night. Stars appeared. The Milky Way emerged. The ridges went dark. At 11, the lights came on, all 9. The full ring, pulsing in their individual patterns. And then, as before, slowly synchronizing, converging, aligning, 9 points of cold light breathing together around my tower. And this time, as the unified pulse established itself, it began to accelerate. Not slow, not the drowsy descent that had nearly pulled me under before. Faster. The interval between flashes shortened. The ring pulsed quicker and quicker, like a heartbeat increasing, like something waking up, and I felt my own heart matching it, speeding, my breathing quickening, my pupils dilating, a flush of heat in my face and chest. The pulse reached a rate of about 2 flashes per second and held there, and the lights were no longer just on the ridges. There was light in the air between them, a faint luminous filament connecting each point to its neighbors, like a web of cold fire drawn across the sky, and the web pulsed too, and at its center, at the geometric center of the ring, was my tower. I understood then. Not intellectually, not the way you understand a sentence or a math problem. I understood the way you understand a piece of music, the way a chord resolves, and your body knows the resolution is correct before your mind names the notes. The signal wasn't a message. It wasn't trying to tell me something. It was a structure, a mechanism. The lights on the ridges were nodes. The filaments between them were connections. The numerical sequences weren't data. They were calibration protocols, tuning the nodes to each other, establishing the precise relationships that allowed the web to form. And the tower, my tower, Sheephead Point, was the focal point, the instrument, the receiver. The observers hadn't been watching the signal. The signal had been watching the observers, testing them, tuning to them, finding the ones who would pay attention, who would record the patterns, who would find the frequency, who would come back up the mountain instead of driving away. The isolation wasn't a job requirement. It was a prerequisite. You had to be alone. You had to be the only consciousness in the focal point. You had to be receptive and unanchored and willing to be tuned. 87%, the voice had said. 87% calibrated. And the last 13% required me to go to Dome Peak. I did not go to Dome Peak. I want that to be clear. I want whoever hears this to know that I stood in the center of that pulsing web of light with my heart hammering in synchronization with the rhythm, and I felt the pull, felt it in my muscles, in my legs, in the directional orientation of my body which had turned without my willing it to face bearing 210, and I did not go. Instead, I picked up the Green Forest Service logbook, the official one, and I opened it to a blank page and I wrote, in handwriting that was barely legible because my hands were shaking, "To whoever reads this, do not watch the light, do not record the patterns, do not look for the frequency, do not go to Dome Peak, leave. If you feel the pull, that means it's working. Leave." I tore the page out and placed it inside the front cover of the logbook, where the next observer would find it. Then I put on my headlamp and my pack, and I walked out of the cab and down the stairs and into the dark. The lights were still pulsing. The web was still glowing. The trail was visible in my headlamp beam, rocky and pale against the darker ground. I walked north, away from bearing 210, away from Dome Peak, down the switchbacks, into the trees, into the cover of the forest, where the light from the ridges was blocked by the canopy. I hiked through the night, 9 miles in the dark, on a trail I could barely see, tripping over rocks and roots, my headlamp making the shadows swing wildly around me. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I held my course north and down, away from the tower, away from the light, away from the focal point. Somewhere around mile 6, the pulsing static on the radio in my pack, I'd taken it after all, I don't remember packing it, came through the fabric of the bag, audible in the silence of the forest. I stopped and took the radio out and held it. The static pulsed, and beneath it, faintly, the composite voice. Sheephead. Signal alignment is at 91%. Return to the tower. Calibration is nearly complete. 91. It had been 87. I had moved away from the tower, and the alignment had increased. Not decreased. Increased. I stood on the dark trail with the radio in my hand, and I felt the understanding shift again, the way it had been shifting all summer, each new piece of information reframing everything before it. I'd assumed the tower was the focal point. I'd assumed that going to Dome Peak was the final step. But the alignment had increased when I left, which meant the focal point wasn't the tower. It was me. I was the instrument, not the building, not the location. Me. My nervous system, my pattern recognition, my consciousness, tuned over weeks of isolation and observation and sleeplessness and signal exposure into a receiver for whatever the web of lights was transmitting. The tower was scaffolding. The numbers were calibration. The pull toward Dome Peak wasn't the final step. It was a distraction, a test maybe, to see if the receiver was independent enough to resist a direct instruction while still remaining in the network. And by walking away while still carrying the radio, still attuned, still inside the pattern, I hadn't escaped. I'd optimized. 91%. I dropped the radio. I didn't turn it off. I dropped it on the trail and stepped over it, and kept walking. I walked faster. I walked as fast as the terrain allowed in the dark, stumbling, catching myself on trees, my headlamp beam lurching. I focused on the physical, the feeling of my boots on rock, the burn in my thighs, the cold air in my lungs. Concrete, immediate, bodily reality. I did not let myself think about the numbers. I did not let myself look for patterns in the shadows. When I noticed the rhythm of my footsteps, I deliberately broke it, stepping irregularly, arrhythmically, denying the pattern-matching impulse any purchase. I reached the trailhead at 3:40 in the morning. My truck was there. I got in. I started the engine. I drove to the highway. I turned south, toward Idaho, away from Sula, away from Missoula, away from everything I knew. I drove with the radio off and the windows up, and I focused on the road and the center line and the headlights, and I did not look at the ridges on either side of the highway, because I knew, without looking, that if I looked I would see the lights. I drove to Salmon, Idaho, which was the first real town across the border. I checked into a motel. I closed the curtains. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, and I didn't sleep, but I was inside a building with no windows facing the mountains, and the lights couldn't reach me there. In the morning, I called the Sula Ranger District from the motel phone. A voice answered. It was Darlene's voice, or what I recognized as Darlene's voice, and it sounded normal, warm, human, real. Sula Ranger District. Darlene, it's the Sheephead Observer. I've left the tower. I'm in Salmon. Oh, goodness. Are you all right? What happened? And I opened my mouth to tell her everything. The lights, the patterns, the frequency, the voice, the web, the alignment percentage, all of it. And what came out was, personal emergency. I need to resign the position. I'm sorry to hear that, she said. I understand. We'll send someone to close up the tower. You take care of yourself. Darlene, I said, how long has it been since you heard from me? You called in this morning. Before this call, your morning report at 0800. I didn't call in this morning. I've been driving since 4 a.m. I didn't have a radio. A pause. Then, well, someone called in from Sheephead this morning with your morning report. Must have been a glitch. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I hung up. I checked out of the motel. I drove to Boise, because Lauren was in Boise, and she was the only person I could think of who might look at me and tell me if I still looked like myself. I showed up at her apartment, unshowered and wild-eyed, and 20 pounds lighter than when she'd last seen me. And she opened the door and stared at me and said, Jesus, what happened to you? I said, I need you to tell me something. Am I acting like myself? Do I seem like me? She studied me for a long time. Then she said, come inside. I stayed in Boise for 2 weeks. I ate. I slept in a room with blackout curtains. I didn't go outside at night. I didn't look at the sky. Slowly, incrementally, the pull faded. The compulsion to find patterns loosened its grip. My sleep normalized. My appetite returned. I started to feel like a person again rather than an antenna. But it didn't go away entirely. It's been months now and I still catch myself. I'll be driving and I'll notice that the cars ahead of me are spaced at regular intervals, and I'll start counting the gaps. I'll be in a grocery store and I'll notice the flicker rate of a fluorescent light, and my hand will twitch toward my pocket for a pen to record it. I'll wake at 11 at night, exactly 11, and my body will orient south-southwest before I'm fully conscious, and I'll have to deliberately, physically turn myself to face another direction. 91%. That's what the voice said. Whatever process was started, it got to 91% before I dropped the radio and walked away. I don't know what 100% would have meant. I don't know what I would have become. I don't know if Garza got there, or Purcell, or any of the others who went quiet and didn't come back. I do know this. I called the Sula Ranger District again in September, from a blocked number, and asked about the Sheephead Point lookout. The woman who answered, not Darlene, a voice I didn't recognize, said the position had been filled for the remainder of the season. Everything was normal. The current observer was doing well. I asked who the current observer was. She said, his name is Garza, Tomas Garza. He came back for another season. I hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand. Garza, who had left and not returned. Garza, whose last logbook entries were empty of everything human. Garza had come back. And I keep thinking about something I noticed in those logbooks. Something I didn't register at the time because I was focused on the light entries, but which I can't stop thinking about now. Every observer who mentioned the light in their logbook, every single one, had the same first entry, the same opening line in their first day's log, before the weather readings, before anything else. I'd been looking for a way out when I found this listing, or some version of it, some way of saying, I was lost. I was alone. I was looking for distance from my life. The isolation was what drew me. The tower didn't need a person. It needed a specific kind of person. Someone already resonant. Someone already tuned to the frequency of withdrawal and separation. Someone whose pattern recognition systems were already hungry, already reaching, already looking for meaning in the empty spaces. Someone like me. I have the note I tore from the logbook. I kept a copy. I wrote it for the next observer, the one who would come after me, the one who would find the listing on the federal job board and think that isolation was what they needed. I wrote, do not watch the light. But I know now that the kind of person who takes a fire lookout job in the Bitterroot Range is exactly the kind of person who would read that note and watch the light anyway. Because the kind of person who seeks that altitude of solitude is the kind of person who can't resist a signal, who needs the pattern, who has to know. And I know something else. The pull at 11 o'clock, the south-southwest orientation, the 91%. It hasn't gone down, not in all these months. Some nights I think it's higher. Some nights I lie in bed in Lauren's spare room in Boise, and I feel the mountains to the east like a magnetic field, and I hear, just at the edge of hearing, just below the threshold of what I can be certain is real, the pulse. 4 seconds on, 3 seconds off, patient and precise and waiting. 91%. That's not a wall. It's not a barrier. It's a threshold that I haven't crossed. And thresholds don't close just because you walk away from them. They wait. I've started seeing the job listing again. Not looking for it. Just seeing it. On my phone. In browser tabs I don't remember opening. Federal Job Board. Fire Lookout Observer. Bitterroot National Forest. Ravalli County, Montana. GS3. Housing provided. June through October. Tolerance for extended isolation required. The listing is for next season. The position is at Sheephead Point, and every time I close the tab, it reappears. I haven't applied. I want you to know that. I haven't applied yet.